Hey everybody, Alan Arnette here with another podcast on the blog on alanarnette.com. It is tax day in the US, April 15th, and I still got to get my taxes done. But first, we've got John Black. Hey John, how you doing?
Good afternoon, Alan. Very well, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man, I appreciate your time. So, John just got back from Annapurna, and we know that two Sherpas lost their lives in an avalanche, and that John's teammate Warren Eva, became the first South African to summit Annapurna. Also, John has a good career in climbing. He summited Mount Everest with Russell Bryce back in 2009. He's got Ama Dablam, and he's also got K2 a couple of years ago. So we're going to talk about all of that. John, now you're in the UK, correct?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of have dual citizenship, South African and British. So I guess you can pick whichever country you want to honor a mountain when you climb it.
Something like that. I enjoy moving back and forth between the two.
Yeah, two great countries. I've been to both of them. Tabletop Mountain down in South Africa, down in Cape Town is a beautiful place, and going down to the tip and seeing the so-called jackass penguins. That was really a lot of fun. And of course, London and Britain is a great country as well. So let's kind of go back, and before we get to Annapurna, we'll kind of switch back and forth. Let's talk about Everest, Annapurna, and then we'll wrap up with K2. So Everest, you were with the legend Russell Bryce back in 2009. So tell me what that was like, being part of a Russell Bryce Himalayan Experience Hymex team.
I think calling Russell Bryce a legend is probably pretty apt and pretty accurate. Even 16 years after that expedition, you mention his name in Himalayan circles amongst the Sherpa or guides or clients, and anyone that's been an enthusiast of Himalayan mountaineering in the last 20, 30 years knows who Russell Bryce is. And
Right.
it was an absolute privilege to be on an expedition with him all those years ago. And it served as quite a high benchmark for all the expeditions post then to be judged against. And I think Russell's passion for Everest and the Himalayas and his laser-like focus on safety and particularly the welfare of his Sherpa is probably an approach many of us, both clients and mountaineers and guides, could probably learn something from. But it was an absolute privilege. I still think back to those days fondly, and in many, many ways, I think Russell was well ahead of the time in terms of
Yeah.
things he introduced to Everest.
I've got fond memories of being on expeditions with Phil Crampton of Altitude Junkies, and Phil and Russell were great friends. And Russ coming over and drinking whiskey in the dining tent until the wee hours of the morning with Phil, and I guess what happens in Nepal stays in Nepal. So just, he was
Something like that.
I interviewed him many times, and just his knowledge of the mountain and also his intuition was just really incredible, especially that year. I think it was 2012 when he thought that the ice fall was too dangerous and canceled his entire expedition. Can you imagine that?
He was incredibly bold, but as I mentioned, he was also 100% focused on the safety of his Sherpa and his clients. And at the time, I think it must have been one of the most high-profile
Mm,
expedition calls made when he cancelled his entire expedition with all of those clients, all of that money because of safety. And in the end, he proved to be correct,
right.
although that accident happened, later. But he certainly foresaw it.
Yeah, I guess what I understand is that Tashi, his Siddhar, his lead Sherpa, he became very concerned that the Serac that was hanging on it's always hanging on the west shoulder to the climber's left as you're going up the ice fall, that it was gonna release
Absolutely.
and come down on top of the ice fall, and he Herman decided, he didn't want to send his team through, and Russell agreed with him, and they canceled it. And then 2 years later, sure enough, that thing did a piece of it released, and it took 16 lives, 16 Sherpas. So he was right. The timing was a little bit off, but he was absolutely right. Yeah. Also, Adrian Bollinger was he was working for Russell in 2009.
He was, and I guess like all of us, he was a lot younger at the time, and I think he was still relatively early in his professional Himalayan guiding career. And at the time, I think we all recognized that Adrian was an incredible high altitude athlete.
Oh,
He is incredibly strong at altitude, a very good guide. And it's been interesting to watch from the sidelines as his business has grown and how he's sort of found his own path through guiding in the Himalayas. And we bumped into him again on Ama Dablam in 2013. We were there on a private trip, and Adrian was there with clients guiding. And it was a particularly poor year on Ama Dablam. Almost all the expeditions left, and we hung out basically as long as our flights would allow us. And we identified the very last day we could potentially summit. The route hadn't been opened. There'd been a number of attempts to open the route across the Mushroom Ridge, which no one had done. And the day before we needed to do it, Adrian and his team opened the route across the Mushroom Ridge and up to the summit. And we were very fortunate to be able to slot in the day after them and make it to the summit in what had been a really, really rough year. But again, it was a sign of him and his team's strength.
yeah, Adrian, of course, is the co-founder of Alpenglow, and I consider him to be a good friend now. And he's a frequent guest on my podcast, and I was lucky enough or fortunate enough to be invited to his on the Duffel Shuffle episode previous to the last one. But yeah, you're right. He often credits Russell with a lot of the lessons that he learned in the mountains, especially about safety. And that's one of the reasons that Adrian, number one, he's never had a fatality in his entire history of Alpenglow, whether it's a climber or a staff Sherpa or other guide. But yeah, he's really kind of set the bar for quality in many ways. So good for both of them. So you've been able to climb with some really nice people, some really luminaries in our industry. By the way, how
Absolutely.
was Ama Dablam? Did you like that one? That was my favorite peak of all, not of all times, but it was when I first saw John. When I first saw Ama Dablam, I told somebody, I said, "That's unclimbable, right?" And they said, "Oh no, people climb it." I said, "Oh, I could never do it." And then a couple of years later, I actually summited it, and I just loved it. What did you think of it?
It was a fantastic mountain. In many ways, I'm glad to have climbed it so long ago, 12 years ago, because
Mm.
like many other Himalayan mountains, it seems to be getting unreasonably popular and busy. But it was a very special mountain. I first saw it trekking up to Everest Base Camp in
Yeah.
2009 and was fixated by the mountain. And 4 years later, went back with a couple of mates and climbed it privately and had an amazing time. Like I say, tough season, very cold base camp, but a fantastic climb, so mixed, so diverse. And the views from Ama Dablam, obviously throughout the Himalaya, are amazing.
That's the first time I even considered climbing Everest was from the summit of Ama Dablam. I was there with Adventure Consultants and the late David Hiddleston, and we were coming down, and Dave looked at me and said, "Okay, mate, you did well on this one, so now it's time for you to go to Everest." And I went, "What?" And that was the first time that seed was planted. It's amazing how those things happen. So let's talk about Annapurna. Tough season this year. A lot of people, record number of permits that were issued. But first off, the conditions. I mean, Ngima G kept talking about how this was the last time he's going to go, never again. It's just too dangerous now. So tell us about how the mountain, the conditions. We understand that you didn't even use crampons to go from base camp up to camp one.
Correct. There's a little bit of irony in that because Warren and I, as you mentioned, climbed K2 in 2022, and we were a little bit sort of frustrated by the course that Himalayan mountaineering was taking. And after K2, we thought, well, let's go to Annapurna because there'll be even less people in Annapurna, hopefully less going on, and we'll have a bit more of an expedition as we'd like in the Himalaya. So we, after doing quite a lot of research, settled on Annapurna. And as it turns out, this season, I think there were more permits issued for Annapurna than any mountain other than Everest, which certainly wasn't expected or part of our plan. But we had received reports quite early in the season from Mingmaji and others that Annapurna was quite dry, but we didn't fully appreciate how dry it was until we arrived in base camp. And base camp's relatively low at about 4,150 meters odd. So it is a low base camp and is often cited as being quite warm. But the walk from base camp to Camp 1 was entirely in trainers or light hiking boots. And truth be told, a fair amount of the route from Camp 1 to Camp 2 probably also would have been you would have been quite comfortable in lightweight hiking boots.
Wow.
But where the problems really started was, just below Camp 1 to a lesser extent, and then all the way up, because there'd been very little snowfall in the early part of the season. There was lots of dry ice. The mountain was very, very dry. And higher up, there was quite a lot of open crevasses and almost sort of an icefall type effect. So we originally thought that that might be a good thing. Yeah, Annapurna, as you'll know, is infamous for avalanches. So we thought that perhaps a drier mountain with less snow might lead to less avalanches. And that didn't turn out to be the case at all because there was still ice falling off the mountain with a little bit of snow, creating an avalanche anyway. But the lack of snow made the climbing, particularly from Camp 2 to Camp 3, really, really hard. So by the time we arrived at base camp, we had some sort of insight into how things were going to be. But it was only as we started climbing higher that we realized just how much of a challenge that presented in certain aspects on the mountain.
And I guess there's gully is not the right way to describe it, but between Camp 2 and 3 is pretty much of a funnel, and that tends to be very, very avalanche prone. I mean, that's been known forever. So when you were going through that area, I know that you guys. So originally you wanted to summit earlier than you did, but just conditions kept you from not doing it. With high winds as well.
Yeah, there was very, very high winds for quite a long period. So when we arrived in base camp, the weather in base camp was actually fantastic. And the weather up to Camp 1 and Camp 2 was great. But every single day when you looked up to the top, to the summit, you could see the winds were nuclear and they were blowing from the other side of the mountain. So we were
Oh,
quite well protected. But up high, the winds were, 100 k's an hour, 110, 115 k's an hour. Um, and as you say, the route from Camp 2 to Camp 3 is very exposed, particularly for a specific part of the route where you're climbing under effectively sort of a col or a coombe, and anything that falls at the top is just going to sort of come straight down at you.
yeah.
And we saw a number of small avalanches in that col while we were there. Obviously, there were avalanches all over, but there in particular. And as I said earlier, we weren't expecting large numbers of people on Annapurna, but the day that we left Camp 2 to go up to Camp 3 on our sort of summit attempt, Warren and I left Camp 2, I think probably last, or certainly very close on last that morning. I think we left Camp 2 at about 8 or 8:30 because there were quite a lot of people moving ahead of us, and we didn't want to be caught in a traffic jam. But heading up towards that particular coal area, at one stage we saw 11 people on the fixed lines exactly in the apex of what
Oh,
would be an avalanche path. And many of them were going very, very slowly and were there for much longer than they should have. Fortunately, by the time we got there, the crowds had cleared because we started quite a bit later and we had a relatively clear path up into the rock band and out of avalanche danger. So that wasn't by accident that we sort of had a clear path, but we certainly were alarmed at the number of people and how slowly they were moving. Similar to K2, as you'll know from your trip, one of the things you can do to increase safety is to move quickly in the
right,
dangerous parts. Now, I'm
right.
not saying that you must race or rush it, but moving strong and moving quick is one of the few things you can do to increase safety. And we were alarmed by how slowly some of the people were moving. And like I said, I need to just reinforce it isn't a race, but the quicker you move, the less time you're exposed to the danger. And for instance, that day from Camp 2 to Camp 3 took Warren and I about 5.5 hours at what we felt was quite a relaxed pace. But we spoke to many people who took 9, 10, and up to 14 hours for the same climb, more than double. And that just means you place yourself in danger for more than twice the time. And the likelihood of something going wrong is twice as high. Um, so that was a concern.
So that area is similar to the bottleneck on K2 between 2 and 3 on Annapurna. So we're not going to we're not going to throw anybody under the bus here, but it sounds to me like that the level of experience was in question for some of the clients that were on the teams that were there. That partly could explain why they were going so slow. They just didn't have either the experience or the energy or the fitness to go at a pace that was required.
I agree, absolutely. I'm not going to call people out. It's not my place to say who should or
Yeah,
shouldn't be on a mountain,
right.
but there were certainly people there that we observed that didn't have the technical skills to climb the steep sections of ice, the steep sections of rocks, weren't able to jumar efficiently, weren't able to just move independently and efficiently and quickly enough on the mountain. Um, and that I think is a big part of it. And then secondly, there were people who just weren't physically fit enough and strong enough, in my view. And that was compounded in their defense partially by not being adequately acclimatized. And as we'll probably discuss a little bit more just now, that was a very, very big part of my thinking of turning around was that the lack of acclimatization. Having said that, Warren and I and some other climbers we spoke to had intended to spend a lot more time on the mountain. Whereas I would guess at least half of the people we met arrived in Annapurna with the view to be up and down and off the mountain within 7 to 10 days, which
Yeah,
is, in my opinion,
yeah, that's
in my view,
unrealistic.
is totally unrealistic. And that's why people were so poorly acclimatized and partly contributed to moving so slowly because they simply weren't acclimatized. They'd been on one rotation in many cases, hadn't even slept in Camp 2. They had tagged Camp 2, come down to base camp for a rest, and then gone for the summit. Camp 2 on Annapurna is 5,500 meters. So they had slept in Camp 1 at about 5,100, tagged Camp 2 at 5,500, went back to base camp, and then planned to go up to the summit at 8,100 meters, more or less. Maybe I'm old school, maybe I'm too conservative, but I think that's incredibly risky. And that is a big reason why people are moving so slowly, along with perhaps inadequate technical skills or physical
Yeah,
skills. And this is a broad generalization. This isn't targeting
sure.
any individuals,
Yeah.
just our observations. And that played out later on in the expedition.
But this is similar to like on Everest that I'm also old school. Hi, my name is Alan. I'm old school, and I own it. But I think on Everest that you should go spend the night at Camp 3. But these days, they go up and tag maybe 7,000 meters on the Lhotse face, and then come back down, and then they begin using supplemental oxygen from Camp 2 these days, where it used to be you began at a very low flow from Camp 3. I'm sure that's what you did with Russ in '09. Did you see people using supplemental oxygen starting at Camp 2 on Annapurna?
I saw two people using supplemental oxygen below Camp 3 on Annapurna.
Yeah.
But again, bear in mind, Annapurna, the camps are quite low. Camp 3 was at 6,400. So
Oh, wow.
even if you only went on to Camp 3 at 6,400, that's still pretty low.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
that's not seven.
no, not even close. And again, that was also a big factor in my decision to turn around was a very, very low high camp and lack of Camp 4.
Yeah, let's talk about that. So, I mean, I did a podcast with Wilco van Rulen, who turned around on, I think it was Makalu, he was telling me, and he turned around because he was not, he just didn't feel like it was his time, and he had a choice of going on supplemental oxygen or climbing without it, which is his style. And Wilco is very, I mean, he's very hardcore in climbing without O's. He wants to do it his style, and I loved hearing him go through his mind. That's what I'd like to talk to you about, John, is that when, I mean, look, you've Everest, K2, Annapurna, that's kind of the three biggies out there. And with all due respect to Makalu and some of the others, Naga Parbat, but you're going up there, you're with Warren, you're with your mate. You guys had summited K2 a couple of years earlier. You were in great fitness, but something in your head, something in your intuition told you that this was not right for you to keep going. Now, Warren continued to go and he summited, but you turned around. Tell us about that. What was going through your head?
No, I think it had been building up through to summit night. Our plans, I think for anyone who was following our story on Facebook, probably thought that we were all over the place because our plans kept changing almost every day.
Yeah,
When Warren and I went to Annapurna, our original plan was to do minimum of two, but ideally three rotations up to and including Camp 3 before going for the summit. Then all of a sudden we thought we might only do the two rotations, and then there was a change in the weather and a short weather window, and we'd only done one rotation and slept in camp two. So then we changed our plans, or to some degree, our plans were changed for us by the operators. And we were then, next thing, we were on our bid for the summit. And, I think I'd recorded a video saying that our chances were sort of sketchy at best,
Yeah.
but that we would try because it looked like there would be quite considerable snow for a long period thereafter. So on our summit rotation, we skipped camp one, went straight to camp two, slept there for a second night, hoping to sort of acclimatize a little bit more. The other half of our team was also meant to summit a day earlier than us. So by the time we got to camp three, they should have left camp three. So by the time we got to camp three, planning our bid for the summit later that night or that evening, we intended to leave at about 7 or 8 p.m. I'd sort of
And there was no
we
camp four this year. Normally there's a
There was
camp
no camp four.
four, but the conditions
Correct.
didn't allow them to create a camp four. So you had to go from three, which made for an abnormally long summit push.
So typically on Annapurna Camp 3, which this year was the high camp for most people, is about 6,400 meters, and Camp 4 would be 7,100. So normally on Annapurna, your summit night is about 1,000 meters of climbing. This year it was more like 1,700 meters of climbing because
Ooh.
of the lack of Camp 4. I obviously didn't go as high as where Camp 4 ordinarily is, so I can't comment, but I was told that by the operators that conditions did not allow a Camp 4 to be established, and that may or may not be the case. But I'm also of the view that a rush for the summit and a rush to move on to subsequent mountains may have affected the operators' thinking around the time and resources required to establish a Camp 4.
So they want to take their resources and knock off Annapurna, then move it to Everest and Lhotse. So they were in a hurry kind of to move on.
Yes, and depending on the operator, in some cases it was Everest and Lhotse, but in other cases it was either Dhaulagiri
Yeah.
or Makalu or somewhere else. So I think the time and the resources required to establish a Camp 4 wasn't particularly attractive, and they'd rather have the clients summit or attempt to summit from Camp 3. So we arrived at Camp 3, Warren and I arrived at Camp 3, I think at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, maybe 2:30 or something like that. We had a couple of hours rest, got ready, and the plan was to leave between 7 and 8 for the summit. A couple of other members of our team left for the summit at about 4:35, and Warren and I left our camps, left our tent, like I said, around about 7:20. But I'd been feeling a little bit uncomfortable with the plan for a while. We left Camp 3. Warren was just ahead of me. I got caught behind two people who were either turning around or having some struggles shortly after leaving Camp 3. So I lost Warren pretty quickly. He climbed slightly ahead of me. I got caught behind two people, and that 1 minute gap quickly became a 5 minute gap and then is out of sight. I climbed for a while. It was a pretty good evening to summit, very little wind. There was a little bit of snowfall, which bothered me a bit, it's being Annapurna in particular because of avalanche risk. But it was a good evening, low wind, relatively warm at that stage, relatively clear skies. And I climbed for about 30 or 40 minutes with this nagging premonition that I was perhaps making a mistake
Hmm.
and that I was climbing against my better judgment for my circumstances. And I need to stress this is for my circumstances.
Right.
This isn't a judgment on any other climbers or anyone else's evaluation or risk or
Sure.
circumstances. I was feeling strong. I was feeling healthy. I was warm. I was happy. My equipment was working well. And I just kept thinking to myself that this is not how I envisaged climbing Annapurna or any 8,000 meter mountain for that matter. I'd always promised my family and my friends that I'd climb as safely as I reasonably could, and I would do everything in my power to try and minimize unnecessary risk. And essentially, it just bothered me considerably that I was attempting to do a 1,700 meter summit night, poorly acclimatized on a very dangerous mountain. And I knew that I had to get the 1,700 meters up and I had to get the 1,700 meters back down without unnecessarily endangering my life or my fingers and toes or placing unnecessary, unreasonable risk on those around me, either the Sherpa I was climbing with, Ngima, or other Sherpa or other climbers. And I eventually stopped. I sat down in the snow for quite a long time, probably at least half an hour. And I just sat there pretty content, thinking about my circumstances, thinking about my priorities, and pretty quickly, I came to the conclusion that this isn't how I wanted to push for the summit on Annapurna. The fact that there was no Camp 4 was a massive factor.
Well,
Summiting Camp 4 is 1,000 meters of climbing to the summit. Summiting from Camp 3 is 1,700 meters of ascent and 1,700 meters back down in a much longer day. And I was concerned that being poorly acclimatized, I could find myself suffering from HAPE or haste. If my oxygen system failed, I was pretty screwed, and that it just wasn't within my judgment of what was a sensible, prudent, responsible way to climb a mountain as infamous and dangerous as Annapurna. Um, I was very disappointed. I was very sad. But when I made the decision, there were no tears. There was no heartache like that. It was a pretty clear decision. I was turning around on my terms. I wasn't turning around because I was too tired or too cold, or I didn't have any convenient excuses. I couldn't blame my gear, couldn't blame my health, I couldn't blame conditions. It just wasn't right for me. And it wasn't the terms upon which I wanted to climb Annapurna. So, I turned around against the protest of my Sherpa, who kept just saying, turn the oxygen up, turn the oxygen up. And I said, he didn't quite understand my language. Essentially that's got nothing to do with it.
yeah,
And went back to Camp 3, obviously bitterly disappointed, very, very sad.
sure.
Climbing a mountain like Annapurna takes a huge amount of training, of finances. There were lots of people following us on social media. I work in the outdoor industry, so there's a little bit of pressure from the industry for performance, friends and family, and all the rest. But I was comfortable with my decision. I knew it would take me a long time to reconcile the decision, and I sat in Camp 3, had a sleepless night in Camp 3, watching things unfold, or proverbially watching things unfold, and hoping Warren in particular, my very good long-standing climb partner, made it to the summit and back. Um, and I wanted to stay in Camp 3 to welcome Warren back to Camp 3. But certainly the feeling amongst the Sherpa was that we should get out of Camp 3 as quickly as possible, because there was limited space in Camp 3, and because they were concerned about potential traffic on the ropes going down. So the more people like myself that could get down sooner, the less people would have to go back down later. So I left Camp 3 the following morning and proceeded down to Camp 2. And on that way, uh, I witnessed the sort of by now infamous avalanche.
So, yeah, that decision to turn around, as a person that's turned around 3 times. So, yeah, I can completely relate as a person that turned around 3 times on Everest, just underneath the balcony. That I've also stood there, just had that 1,000 yard stare, just thinking about, I know I can go higher, but can I go lower? And what's the right decision to make? It's if for people that have never been in that situation, it, some people may go, well, it's obvious. Yeah, just turn around. And what's the problem? You don't want to die on the mountain, but there is the summit fever aspect of it. But there's also, that you've got this big goal and that this is God, this is a moment, and you get to maybe summit this big mountain, and it's a hard decision. But that actually didn't become your story. I mean, part of your story, but then you started heading back down and you ran into a couple of the Sherpas that just 15 minutes later the avalanche hit.
So I came down from Camp 3, left relatively early, overtook a couple of people on the ropes going down, got through the sort of high risk part of the avalanche path. At the lower part of the col, there's a bit of a sort of a steep, when you're going down, it's a long, steep abseil. When you're going up, it's quite a steep ice climb. Got onto the sort of avalanche field on the glacier and made mention to my Sherpa Ngima that it was a fresh avalanche all around, that had obviously come down overnight, and that all the footprints were gone. And
Wow.
there was just two climbers ahead of us, a Scottish gentleman and another Sherpa. So we proceeded down the glacier heading towards the crevasse, which sort of split the route from Camp 2, just above Camp 2. We got to the crevasse, and there was this Scottish gentleman and three Sherpa. And the three Sherpa were fixing the aluminium ladder that was spanning the crevasse. So on the way up, we had crossed the aluminium ladder, was in quite bad shape, and the Sherpa had taken upon themselves to fix the ladder. which was obviously fantastic. So we sat there. I sat there for probably 20, 30 minutes, sort of kind of talking to the Sherpa while they lashed the ladders together, put them over the crevasse. We then helped them anchor them into the glacier with a couple of snow pickets, etc., etc., and then crossed the crevasse. I was heading down towards Camp 2, and they were heading up towards Camp 3. So we crossed the crevasse. At that stage, they were on the lower edge of the crevasse, on the Camp 2 side. And after sort of, I guess, their energies and their efforts fixing the ladder, they sat down and had a couple of sips of juice and seemed to take a little bit of a rest. As I was walking off, they offered me a piece of chocolate, which I gladly accepted, said cheers and thanks very much. And I decided not to wait for them and continued off towards Camp 2. And probably 10 to 15 minutes later, possibly closer to 10 minutes, I heard the crack of an avalanche,
Oh,
turned around, and I had a very, very good view of the route all the way up to Camp 3. And I saw what looked like sort of a bit of an ice fall at the higher end of the couloir. And it just sort of started to gain momentum. At the time, I thought to myself that I was miles out of its path. And so I started to film it on my phone. And as is the cases with avalanches, is it just got bigger and bigger and bigger and
yeah.
more powerful. And
My
you know, in
word.
hindsight, the avalanche fell
Avalanche
nearly 1,000
between
vertical
Camp 3 and
meters
Camp 2.
from above Camp
I was
3
there
all the way down
20
almost to
minutes
Camp
ago.
2. So it had sort of a
This
thousand
is
vertical meters to gain
frightening.
momentum and bulk. And as it
I'm
goes,
safe,
obviously just collects more ice, more
but
snow,
some
more
people may
rocks.
not have been.
Um, by the
I
time it
hope
reached
everyone's
its
okay.
peak, I was
This
reasonably
is
confident that I
this is what
wasn't in
Annapurna is
any
famous for.
real risk myself,
Exactly,
but I immediately knew that
exactly
there had
this.
been people behind
I'm
me
on
that
the
I knew
edge
of,
of
and
it.
possibly a few others I
I'm
didn't
safe,
know of that would have been in the path
but
of the avalanche.
wowza.
Yeah.
Um, I filmed the avalanche, stopped recording, and maybe 10, 20 seconds later, sort of the wind rush of the avalanche hit me along with the snow and the ice and all the rest. And I filmed a small second follow-up video showing all the ice and the snow swirling around me and the wind. And I was entirely safe, but on the edge, but it was still an indicator of just how powerful the avalanche had been. Um, and my Sherpa was sort of 30 seconds behind me. He caught up to me, checked that we were all okay, and then hopped on a radio and became very quickly apparent that two Sherpa weren't answering, two Sherpa from Seven Summits Treks, and that they had been hit by the avalanche. Shortly after the first avalanche, a second smaller avalanche struck. So we were very worried about going back into the avalanche um, field to look for people when there was subsequent avalanches falling. So we looked as best as we could through our camera phones. We sort of zoomed in and try and panned around the fields. And then shortly thereafter, I think about 4 or 5 Sherpa from various companies launched a little bit of a search, looked around the area. There was no sign of them immediately visible. There was quite a lot of concern around being in the path of future avalanches. And either the first or the second avalanche, I'm not entirely sure, but it blew away a part of the fixed lines between Camp 2 and Camp 3. And we had a team member and a Sherpa who had missed the avalanche by literally 5 odd meters. After the avalanche, they continued down the fixed lines, but found the fixed lines missing, at which stage they were in the sort of the the high risk part of the avalanche field, and then they had to climb back up the ropes to get out of danger while they could come up with a plan. But it was certainly very unpleasant and very upsetting to have been so close to the Sherpa, having spoken to them and chatted to them, and they literally offered me chocolate, and 10, 15 minutes later they were gone. Later that afternoon at about 5 p.m., a helicopter was sent up to search for as long as it could before sunset, and searches continue the following days. And my understanding is that they located the bodies via RECCO device,
Right.
I think 2 days later, but they haven't been recovered yet. But they were found in the crevasse, which is where we had assumed they would have been blown into the crevasse by the avalanche, and then hundreds of tons of snow and ice dumped on top of them, unfortunately.
And Warren reported that that crevasse was significantly wider than when you guys first went across it.
Yeah, I posted 2 photos on Facebook. The first one I took on the morning of the 7th, and the crevasse was at that point 3 meters wide, and it was kind of 5 or 6 steps on the ladder, and you were across. Warren came down literally 24 hours later, and that aluminium ladder was hanging partly over the crevasse, and the crevasse was probably close to 20 meters wide. So it had gone from 2 or 3 meters wide to 10 times that in the avalanche. It was unbelievably powerful,
So that suggests that the actual glacier moved and the lower part
without a
went
doubt.
faster than the upper part, thus making it wider. So just to pay respect to the two Sherpas who lost their lives, their names are Ngima Tashi Sherpa and Rima Rinje Sherpa. And I know that Seven Summits, they did what they could to try to recover them. But they also issued RECCO reflective tags to all their members and all their Sherpa. That's what they're doing for everybody this year in the Himalaya. Supposedly it's required by Nepalese law, but we know how that goes. Did you guys have RECCO?
No, we didn't.
Yeah, yeah. And I think that's, it's a case like this where it's more about the recovery than the rescue, because, if you're in a crevasse like that, it's really difficult. So, oh my gosh, that's, how did that how did that affect you, John? Emotionally, mentally, was your, flying back to Kathmandu and you thinking about coming that close?
It was very tough. The day after the avalanche, I met the two Sherpas brothers in base camp,
Hmm.
along with the owner of Seven Summits Treks. And, you know, I felt pretty stupid. I didn't have much to say other than, I'm really sorry for your losses.
Yeah,
And they were very nice to me.
yeah, yeah,
That's all I had to say, really. And I was obviously very fortunate to have, or lucky to have missed the avalanche. It was certainly a close call. uh, and a reminder of the risks that we know exist. We all know they exist, but we always hope that it won't be us, or we pretend it'll be someone else, but it won't be us. But sometimes that's not the case, and for them, certainly it wasn't the case. But I also think sometimes as mountaineers, we become quite skilled at compartmentalizing
yes,
our our emotions or our challenges or our opportunities, and you kind of try and put that one in its box and deal with it separately to everything else.
yeah.
Um, yeah, I think it almost comes with the turf. I'm not sure it's a good thing or a bad thing. It just is what it is. But still very upsetting. I reflect on it very, very often, and a reminder to me personally about how thin the margins are.
Yeah, and I unfortunately have had two encounters with that. One on Choi Yu, where a teammate died in his sleep, and per his wishes, that we buried him in a crevasse. But then you begin to consider whether we were going up on our summit bid, he was coming back down, and so then you begin to consider whether you want to continue or not. And and then I think, as you say, rightfully say, that as a mountaineer, you have to compartmentalize that moment. And I put myself in his position, and Alex, and said that, well, if it was me, I would want my teammates to continue to go try to summit in order to honor me, not just to give up. Because this is part of the bargain that you strike when you go climb these big mountains, is that there are these uncontrollable events, and it's just earth shattering. So I guess everybody else was coming back down. They were kind of trapped up at Camp 3 because the fixed ropes were buried by the avalanche. And so a lot of people were able to take helicopters from Camp 3 back to either base camp or, I guess, Kathmandu eventually.
Yes and no. I'm not sure I entirely agree with the sort of finer nuances of what you say. You're right. The ropes were partly blown away. However, they were replaced pretty quickly
Ah, okay.
on the morning of the 8th. And a number of people, including my climbing partner Warren, made their own way down from Camp 3 to Camp 2 and to base camp ultimately. But there were a number of people. There were a number of people on choppers from Camp 3 to Camp 2, some of which were arguably genuine evacuation emergencies, and many who, in my humble opinion, weren't. And
Yeah.
there were climbers who were either too tired, too scared, too intimidated to make their own way back down from Camp 3 to base camp. And chose the chopper route. Um, and it's not the first time it's happened. It won't be the last time.
Yeah.
But I think it is a dangerous trend, a dangerous precedent. I think there's, and again, this is a general statement, not aimed at any particular climber. There's a growing trend of people on these big mountains who just fall back on the belief that if they have any problems, they'll use more oxygen, and if they have problems beyond that, they'll call for a chopper. Um, but as we know, choppers can't fly to all altitudes and they can't fly in all conditions. And I heard that playing out over the radio for nearly 48 hours. People wanting chopper rides, trying to debate to argue whether it's an evacuation or an airlift or a taxi ride or what it was. But really, it's a very concerning trend. And I think there were a number of people who took a chopper down who were well capable of coming down under their own power, but chose not to. And I think that is a debatable assent, but that's a much more controversial debate or argument for another day. But the point is that the route was reopened pretty quickly. I think Warren left Camp 3 at about 8:30 a.m. and came down with ropes in place under his own strength, as did other climbers. He wasn't the only one. But there were a number of airlifts. I counted, I think, 7 people dropped off in base camp that day alone. Um,
Yeah.
Many
Back.
of which I met and observed and would argue that a chopper ride wasn't required. And it also brings into focus a bigger problem, I think, is going to be looming in the Himalaya, as is already the case, of evacuation being uninsurable
Yeah.
or insurance being unattainable because the ratios between premiums and claims is just not sustainable.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you remember that several years ago there was a lot of controversy throughout the Khumbu
Yes.
of mainly trekking, not climbers, but trekkers that were having helicoptered out, and they were charging organizations like Magnus or Global Rescue to pay for these, and it was a scam, is what it was. I think that's gotten relatively cleaned up, but to your point, back in the day, Elizabeth Hawley would not have recognized a helicopter assisted descent as a true summit. And at a minimum, you would have had an asterisk by your name and that would have said aviation assisted and not give you credit for that. So,
Well, in my mind, a mountain climb or an expedition ends back at base camp. It doesn't
it's a
end in
round
camp
trip.
3 or
Yeah.
camp 2. It's a round trip. But again, maybe I'm old school.
No, no, well, you and me both. So let's transition to K2 because my one of my the most significant climbs I ever did, and just it was a lifetime moment for me. And so, talk a little bit about your experience on K2. First of all, how would you compare K2 to Everest and Annapurna, at least up to Camp 3?
I had a number of conversations with Warren about this after he summited Annapurna because it was a question he was asked a number of times.
Yeah,
My my opinion really only holds water until just above Camp 3, whereas he's had the full journey to the summit. But I think Warren and I are on a very similar page that in my experience, our experience, K2 was a significantly harder mountain to climb in totality.
yeah,
The climb on Annapurna from Camp 2 to Camp 3 is is difficult. It's technical. There's some steep ice, there's some rock, etc., etc. But on Annapurna this year, anyway, base camp to Camp 1 was a hike. Camp 1 to Camp 2 was sort of a little bit of stone and rock over a glacier, a little bit of steep rock and ice climbing onto a shoulder and up to Camp 2, pretty straightforward and quick. I think base camp to Camp 1 took us like 3.5 hours. Camp 1 to Camp 2 took us about 2.5 hours. Camp 2 to Camp 3 took us 5.5 hours ish. And then obviously Warren went to the summit. But the days on Annapurna certainly felt shorter and easier and less dangerous than they
hmm,
did on K2. K2, it felt like the mountain was throwing stuff at you all day, every day, either rocks or avalanches or
right.
ice. The camps on K2 are far less comfortable than they were on Annapurna. Annapurna, the camps got a lot more space, they're a lot flatter, etc., etc. And even so far as the approach in, the trek into Annapurna took us 2.5 days at most to get to base camp.
Yeah,
I think it was a total of 13 Ks in total. To get to K2 base camp was more or less 100 Ks each way
right.
over 6 days, sleeping in tents, rough terrain. The travel to K2 and the trek into base camp and the climb above base camp, in my mind, was all significantly more wearing and tiring than Annapurna was. Um, Annapurna definitely Camp 2 to Camp 3 is dangerous, as we've established and as I witnessed firsthand, and there's no two ways about that. Um, and Warren was certainly in agreement that he felt K2 was a significantly harder climb based on our experience. But he had a much longer day till summit of Annapurna because he summited from Camp 3.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it was a relatively straightforward summit day compared to K2, not having to deal with the technical challenges of K2 summit day. Um,
Yeah, I always say the K2 is it starts steep, it's steep in the middle, and it ends steep. It never lets
100%,
up. And that
100%.
and the objective danger, especially when you start making that traverse going from the top of the bottleneck across right below that serac is, I mean, that's just I'm still in denial that I actually did it.
I remember going up, crossing it in the dark was intimidating. I came down in the light and it was terrifying. But I remember having a thought at the time is how did the guys do this nearly 70 years ago? Like I remember even at the time in the moment still thinking to myself, I don't know how the guys did this sort of 70 years before that.
Yeah, we talk about Russell Bryce is a legend, but those guys, House and all those guys that did it back,
Mm,
like you say, he free climbed the house chimney and other features on the
unbelievable.
mountain. Just it's very very inspiring. We climb on the shoulders of legends, I guess is how they say it. So
Cool.
did your Annapurna experience make you second think, have second thoughts about future expeditions, or
It's
you're eager to try
nothing.
again?
I don't think I'll try Annapurna again, simply because I don't want to go on my own. And
Yeah.
my most consistent climbing partner's climbed it, so he's not going back again. So it's
No
unlikely I'm
way.
going to find it's unlikely I'm going to find anyone to go back with me. So I don't think I will. I've got no doubt there'll be other expeditions, whether they're 8,000ers or not. I'm not too sure. You know, the whole 8,000er, the 14 8,000ers have definitely changed the atmosphere in the mountains and the priorities and the type of people they're attracting. And maybe it makes more sense to go and climb a mountain that's 7,800 meters without all the hoo-ha and without the Instagrammers and without the sort of peak baggers that unfortunately the 8,000ers seem to be attracting.
It's
Maybe.
definitely got commercialized, and it's the all 14 now are open for business to almost anyone, no experience required. That's the
I
sad
guess
part
at
of
the
our
end of the
sport.
day, me, like anyone, has to make a decision whether we subscribe to that or want to avoid it. And if we choose to go back to those mountains, I guess we can't really complain about what's going on because we know that's what's going on. So you either
Yeah,
got to opt in or opt
yeah.
out.
The opposite side of what I just said was that it's open for business, no experience required. Is that now the market has really opened up. So you've got people that never ever thought they would have an opportunity to climb these big mountains now have that because I call them a formula climb that now the operators, especially the Nepali operators, are commercializing it and overpowering it with great Sherpa support and fixing the lines. So, but as you witnessed, you saw people that their lack of experience became a liability to other climbers on the mountains, and that's the part I think that needs to be addressed by mainly by the operators. It's not going to be government regulation; it's got to be by the operators. And like we'll wrap this up where we started talking about Russell Bryce and Adrian and people like that. They won't take you if you don't have the proper experience. Full stop. You know.
I also wouldn't, people like Adrian Russell and other operators, they would drive what they felt to be the safest approach to the mountain. They would control the progress. They would control the itinerary and the rotations. These days, I get a sense that many of the operators, due to business and competition pressures, having to keep up with one another, et cetera, are allowing in many cases, inexperienced clients to drive the program and the progress and the process on the mountain, which I think is a bit dangerous. And again, this isn't a criticism of any individual person, but holistically, our team was a composite team of 9 people. Of those 9 people, there were 4 summits. 2 of those 4 people who made it to the summit got down under their own strength. Of the 9 climbers, 4 used a helicopter and 3 paid a visit to hospital. And I believe 2 will be losing fingers and or toes. Those are not great statistics. Um, and I'm reasonably comfortable that it's probably indicative of all the operators, more or less. Um, and and it comes back to the challenges we've already discussed. But those statistics and numbers and odds, in my mind, are not signs of a healthy situation.
Fully agree, John. Fully agree. So, my friend, thank you for taking the time and going through this. I can tell, but at moments it's a little emotional for you, and probably
Mhm.
will continue to be as you process this. But I wish you the best on your next trip, wherever that may be. Maybe north on your own big island there in the UK, or maybe
We'll see.
back down to a tabletop mountain in Cape Town.
It's a great place.
It is a great place. All right. Take care, man. Appreciate it.
Ellen, it's great catching up, and thanks for everything you do. I've been following your blogs and your podcasts and your articles for many years, and I appreciate the value you add to the community and the insights you bring. So thank you to you for what you do.
No, I appreciate that very much. That means a lot. All right. Take
Enjoy your
care.
day. Cheers.